we understand just hours ago, the Iraqi forces strike once again some of the strongholds of IS in Mosul. Help us to understand what exactly is the latest situation.
Yes, thank you very much. The environment is quite difficult. Mosul, Nino, is a very large city. It's the second largest city in Iraq, and it had 3 million inhabitants. So it is not a modest city. It's quite large with a horizontal expansion of houses. We don't have high rises. The houses in Iraq is on a horizontal build-up. So the city is very large, divided into two major sections, the east side and the west side. The river Tigris goes in between. So it is very large. All the city has been, I mean, the center of the city on both sides, east and west, have been liberated. But being a large city on the outskirts, the ISIS still has certain areas that are under the control.
Right.
So it is only natural that we still have some resistance. Of course, this is the victory is a battle victory. We didn't win the war yet. We need to completely wipe out ISIL so that we could say that we completely eradicated Iraq from ISIL fighters. Then the second problem comes up with the second problem, which is the major problem really, is how to clear the people's thoughts, how to get rid of the extremism thoughts that inhabited Mosul even before the entering of ISIS to Mosul.
We are going to
over 6
talk
years,
about some of those points.
Mr.
Al-Mutalibi, we go to the other guest before you talk about specific on that. But even about the so-called the winning of the battle, Mr. Blank, now is quite vague, isn't it? I mean, we have heard about victories from time to time, but none of them was sustainable earlier. So how confident do you think this time it is, despite of the fact that we are still hearing sporadic battles going on right before our show just a few hours ago?
Yes. Well, the victory in Mosul is real. That is verified because we can actually see where ISIS fighters are, what territory they hold, and where they don't. The real question is what happens next. We've seen this before. Areas get cleared, but then they don't get held. And this is where the Iraqi government really has to step up and show that it is the government for all of its people, for the Sunni as well as for the Shia, and not allow what has happened in the past, which is non-governmental forces, Shia militias, to attack these Sunni inhabitants and give way to resentments that bring ISIS back in.
Things that are very complicated at this point, how to maintain the so-called winning battles. Mr. Al-Mutalibi, as you earlier rightly put, is already challenging enough. Who do you think should be playing that role, as being questioned by Mr. Blank earlier? Should that be the newly trained police force inside Iraq, or should that be the military try to hold on to all the key positions inside the city? That's going to put a lot of pressure on the military itself.
Yes, it has to be both sides. We have to have a major humanitarian efforts. We have to have a major cleaning of ideas and thoughts, at the same time as providing actual services and justice to the people. It's not good just to go with guns and blazing fire. That will not resolve the issue. That will create more enemies. ISIS is finished. The people who were supporting ISIS, basically they will be eradicated gradually from the picture. So now a very hard job for the government is to be able to make the inhabitants of Mosul, as we succeeded in Salahuddin, as we succeeded in Ramadi in Anbar province, where we won the hearts of the people and the minds of the people. The same experience must be again conducted in Mosul. Of course, Mosul is more difficult, but nevertheless, the same action must be taken to show the people of the inhabitants there of justice and help, and providing them with all the necessary services that they require.
Since sir, you mentioned about the word justice, there are a lot of cases going on in which there are resentment against what exactly happened. Capturing Mosul was a tall order, as some say. 1.3 million civilians lived in Mosul, as you mentioned earlier, along with estimated 5,000 ISIL fighters in Iraq's second biggest city. Since start of the offensive, the Iraqi government reported nearly 900,000 civilians have been internally displaced in an area controlled by three forces: the Iraqi government, the ISIL, and the Kurds. And now to mention the casualties among the civilians that have been reported by some non-governmental organizations like Amnesty International, for example. So that certainly, Mr. Blank, in Washington, D.C., what do you make of those challenging issues, casualties of the civilians? Some say it is unavoidable, but the numbers seem to be quite high. There's likely to be big resentment against that among the civilians.
You're very right. And there is an enormous challenge in rebuilding Mosul and rebuilding the trust of the people who lived in Mosul, who live in the future in Mosul, and of all Iraqis, of all communities. This is primarily a challenge for the government of Iraq, but the outside world does have a part to play. How much willingness there will be is a big question, given the scope of the challenge and the uncertainty about the approach of the government of Iraq.
Having said all of that, Mr. Yan, what do you think as an observer from the outside? I mean, the war in Iraq, at the very beginning when it was fought, it was not necessarily winning the hearts and minds of the international community. Then after so-called the declaration of the war's winning by the U.S. side, things are getting ever more complicated, and that war continued until today. Now we are hearing from the Iraqi government saying certain battles are being won, but not the war itself either. So what do you make of this prolonged period and the current frustrations likely to challenge the area?
Yeah, if you see from the long perspective the fight against the Islamic State, the liberation of Mosul city is only the first stage of the war against the Islamic State, and this compared to the latter stages, maybe it is more easier. If after the liberation of Mosul, a lot of more works needs to be done, and it's maybe a bigger challenge lies ahead. From the security perspective, the Iraqi government and the international community needs to take necessary measures to bring the sense of stability and security for the civilians living in Mosul, and bring them back to Mosul city. And economically, the Mosul city almost completely destroyed by ISIL militants, and so the Mosul city and the surrounding areas needs to be reconstructed, and this may take years to fulfill this task.
But the question is, who will foot the bill?
Yes.
First of all, and secondly, when you talk about keeping the peace, will the Iraqi army be able to do that? If others are coming in, under what kinds of umbrella? That seems to be extremely important, Mr. Yan.
Yes, the reconstruction efforts. Currently, it seems that both the Iraqi government and the international community don't have any post-Mosul plan, because it has been estimated that it may needs $100 billion to reconstruct the areas previously controlled by Islamic State, and also due to the fight against the Islamic State. In this process, the Shia militia groups become stronger and stronger.
That's
and
right.
This is one of the major concerns for the Sunni populations. So the Iraqi government needs to prevent the Shia militants to have their hands on the Mosul city, and the Iraqi government need to deploy the government forces in the Mosul city.
Complicated enough even when it comes to solutions. But Mr. Blank, I do want to come back to you, because it has always been debated from day one as to what so-called outside forces, what role they should play and could play during this process. In the United States, Mr. Blank, you know better than I do, with the change of administration, there have been a big attitude change about whether more participation or not in what is going on in Iraq from the U.S. perspective. So given all of these factors, what will the outside parties do and how will they do it, Mr. Blank?
Yes, that is a very big question, and I don't think anyone knows the answer. The new administration in Washington does not appear to have a different strategy than the Obama administration when it comes to Iraq. There has been a lot of talk about new strategies, but we haven't really seen anything different on the ground. The big challenge, really, I agree with your guest in Beijing, the big challenge is going to be for the Iraqi government, because unless the Iraqi government can prove itself to be an honest player protecting the lives of Sunni as well as Shia and keeping the Shia militia groups under control, then we're just going to see space opened up for ISIS to come back. And I think in that event, it doesn't matter how much foreign assistance, whether security or money, is provided, as long as the Iraqi government is not perceived as being the supporter of its Sunni population.
I see. Therefore, I have to go to Mr. al-Muttalibi. What about that, sir? Because in Iraq and outside Iraq, there are a lot of chaotic things going on as well, involving regional parties who might want to have a role or two on what is going on inside your country between Sunni and Shia. And as a result, can the Iraqi government, the central government of Iraq, be strong enough to direct the militaries and hold on to what has already been accomplished so far?
First of all, I'm quite surprised to see that many think tanks in the free world misplacing the Iraqi Shia with the problem between the Americans and the Iranians, and calling the Shia of Iraq militias, where in fact the armed forces of Iraq is made of all this Iraqi rainbow. We have Sunnis, Shiites, everybody within Iraq is part of the armed forces. So there are no Shiite militias. We have public mobilization units who are Christians, Yazidi, Sunni, tribesmen Sunni, and some Shias. So the PMUs, the public mobilization unit, which you very surprisingly have been called Shia militias, have nothing to do with entering Mosul. They stayed out in the outskirts. They never entered any built-up areas in Mosul. They are in charge of protecting the border between Iraq and Syria. And they are, as I said, Sunnis and Kurds and Yazidis and Christians. So at any cost, this is very important to understand that many in the world think that Iraqi Shia are Iranians, and that is not the case, just to make sure that people understand that. The problem in Iraq is major, but it's within the world's interest is Iraq does not return into a state of terrorism. Because if Iraq becomes a failed state and an incubator for terrorism, the whole of the Middle East will be infected by this virus. So it's in the interest of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Jordan, and everybody in the Middle East, and even Turkey, is to stand by Iraq, to help us in rebuilding Iraq, maybe foot part of the bill for helping Iraq, or at least stop the propaganda against Iraq, which is fueling the supporters of ISIS. Now that again goes to the international community. We understand that the Americans have an ambiguous plan with Iraq. They are not very clear. Neither Obama was clear. Now Mr. Trump is also not very clear on his stand on Iraq. And how will he assist Iraq? We do have resources, but our resources are in the underground. We have oil in the ground, not for sale.
I
so
see.
maybe part of the package will be to invite nations to help us in excavating the oil and maybe marketing the oil, and provide us with the services and the engineering skills that are required to rebuild and reconstruct these areas.
Well, I need to have our American guest, Mr. Blanc, to respond to that, and then followed by the Chinese guest. Mr. Blanc, first of all, you need to respond to your Iraqi colleagues. Secondly, we all know that even in the neighborhoods of Iraq, the division we are seeing in some of the Gulf countries between Qatar and Kuwait, Saudi Arabia. Secretary Tillerson is now in the region trying to mediate, very unlikely to achieve anything big. So given the circumstances, will those countries, as Mr. al-Baghdadi wished, be able to contribute to the stability?
Well, thank you. I think Mr. Mutalibi is absolutely right when he says that the external world has interfered far too much in Iraq. That definitely includes the United States, which bears a very high degree of responsibility. It also includes Saudi Arabia, Qatar, all of the neighbors. It includes Iran as well. And it includes all of the states that have interfered throughout history, particularly the last few years. We do have to be honest, though. There are Shia militias, there are Sunni militias. These militias have operated outside of the control of the Iraqi government in the past. And if that happens in the future, it will be very difficult for the outside world to play a constructive role.
Well, Mr. Yan, you certainly heard the differences of opinions regarding what exactly is going on inside Iraq between our two other panelists. What is your view here? And meanwhile, so-called the international community under what umbrella to do what for Iraq now?
Yeah, it is the common interest for the international community. But there is one big question need to be answered, and I'm quite worried about the future trend of the combat against the Islamic State, because in the first stage of the combat against the Islamic State, the different parties, including the Middle Eastern countries, Russia, Iran, and the United States and the Europe countries, they all have the common enemy, the Islamic State. But after the first stage of victory against ISIL, there are vacuums left in Iraq and also in Syria. So it seems that these different parties are losing their common enemies. And especially for the Middle Eastern countries, actually their priorities is not to fight Islamic State. Their priorities is to compete for the dominance with Iran, with Russia. So I think more challenges lies ahead for the Middle Eastern countries and also for the international community. How the fight against the Islamic State will evolve in the future.